About 8 months ago, I made a video discussing Disney's animation problem, the first major video I've ever created that was dedicated to my love of Disney that I've shared throughout this entire year. And from that point forward, I made various other videos declaring my love of the past and hatred of the present, dedicated on their downfall of creativity, expressing my problems with the executives who run the company and what has been invested in it. And the main reason for all of that was of course here in 2023, the year that Disney actually turned 100 years old. What would have been expected as a grand celebration of what we loved growing up and still do to an extent. But sadly, as we all know now here at the tail end of 2023, that hasn't been the case where most of their film divisions have been failing at the box office with high budget bombs left and right at a time where the previous CEO actually returned to supposedly fix his successor's mistakes, all of which actually turned out to be more of his own with what his tenure brought to the company after Michael Eisner left from a campaign led by Roy E. Disney, the last Disney involved with Disney. And because of that, I really had to return back to the beginning of where I began to criticize Disney with the problem that has been going on in their animation department, the studio that began this very big company that we all know for today, for the better or worse. Of course, this video is also going to be discussing a little bit of the other studios' failings that I've individually covered, but more just centered around Disney and actually Pixar for that matter, and the financial failings and creative storytelling that they have had issues with. Because when you look at the new Disney era that is failing, it's very reminiscent of the early 2000s failures with Eisner's last years, like I said before, with those box office bombs, and especially the Disney Dark Age covering the period after Walt's death before Eisner actually came in. And these two previous eras are very key to show us that this is a very easily solvable problem by them, but more of how Disney keeps refusing to create anything worthwhile for the majority of it if they have that simple dollar sign actually attached to it. Because as we have seen recently, films like Encanto are actually still worth our time and worth watching as animated films, but sadly become the exception to the rule of where the focus is going on. The focus on safe movies that never change and go for the basic essence of what their story is without doing anything to actually change that formula, keeping the same type of villains they've always had and the same type of heroes they've always had. And the more you see them do it, the more people actually get disinterested into it, pumping out the same things that they have owned without any clear thought down the actual pipeline. I mean, it's not bad to have those types of stories as they can be enjoyed and there are an abundance of ideals that they could offer, but they just aren't offering the true potential that can actually derive from them. Because if we look back at the first Dark Age in the 70s and 80s, that was kind of the big problem. The time where you would think animation could be serious trouble and the Disney company eventually failing. Where Disney could have just shut it down altogether and nothing we knew today from the Renaissance and so forth would ever exist at all. Something that resulted at the tail end of Walt's own life shifting from animation mostly to more real projects like Disneyland, Mary Poppins, and his original vision for Epcot. And the major problem with this was not the animation itself, because there are various beautiful works they have done in that time despite reusing some scenes in their own films, but more about the stories that actually resulted from it, not really being attention grabbing and mainly just being one note. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do enjoy some of it, where most of their animated films up until the Black Cauldron were still box office hits compared to today's bombs, but they aren't as memorable as what we always look back upon in Disney storytelling. They weren't as interesting and mostly fell short of what was expected. Because above all, Walt Disney himself was actually a master storyteller. He knew what to look for at the time for the most part in the golden and silver age of Disney animation, and it really worked, producing every single film up until his death with The Jungle Book coming right after. Where after that very period, it resulted in executives being more focused on trying to focus on the parks and solving Walt's Epcot vision, rather than the animation with the later years of Walt's 9 old men and the older animators with the new generation that lacked any focus or goal than what other was being darker in terms of storytelling. Hence why it was actually called the Dark Age, where most of the films just didn't have that quality in story and songs that they usually associate these movies with, and just didn't feel like the classic fairy tale setting. That for the most part, they just didn't really feel like they should be focusing on this division of the company when the parks was the actual more profitable venture at the time. Where some, like former CEO Ron Miller, tried to do more experimental things at the same time that didn't work, while under the guidance of these new corporate raiders that are threatening to take over the company. Which is where we have to discuss the Black Cauldron in this conversation as the breaking point here. The highest point in the Disney Dark Age that would have almost destroyed Disney animation or the Disney company as a whole, where its production had so many issues it seemed impossible this was going to actually succeed in any way. The first point of this was of course they were making something darker than what most Disney films are, and something that we can agree with today, contrasting with what we remember as the greatest stories they ever had, balancing out other tones, while this one just remained more inconsistent. The film itself just went through so many production changes, from its directors adding more and then removing such, trying to be dark and also being comedic at the same time, then removing it altogether before they could finally focus on a single idea. how the characters are ending up like this or that and why the story is going in this direction. There is a lot more I could tell you about this film and its issues, but the gist of it all was the fact it was a mess and was just released as such. While the animation was great, the writing and the tone was actually met with negative reception, not knowing what the hell it wanted to do, and became a financial failure as a result. People and kids especially were just confused what the hell this was trying to do. But overall, with what this actual failure brought us was a learning point of where they should have gone in the first place. And of course, going back to the actual idea of the stories that made Disney, which of course was spearheaded by Walt's own nephew, his brother's son, Roy E. Disney, who I mentioned earlier and a lot in the Downfall video as well. How he brought in Eisner and Wells after removing his cousin-in-law as the CEO, really caring about Disney animation, wanting a reset with those like Katzenberg coming in and trying to help. That he wanted to help Disney animation get back to what his uncle did, and that's what actually happened when films like The Little Mermaid came into play, getting the talents of those like Howard Ashman and Alan Menken alongside Musker and Clements directing the film, all of which was making a Broadway-style musical for a Disney film, just like what most of the original stories Snow White and Cinderella sort of did. That this here gave animation a proper boost, combining both great storytelling and music together, knowing what musical theater could actually provide with such films. Whereas much as we enjoy this previous dark era of Disney in some aspects of its film, the Renaissance truly brought it upon itself to fully flesh out the world and characters together that most people associate these movies with. And this of course actually includes other films in this era like Hunchback that also went into the darker aspects of Disney storytelling that the Black Cauldron tried to provide, but now actually had a decent and actual story to tell alongside with it, with aspects that Disney is known for in its music and its story. Every story in this era of Disney, whether it be Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin and Lion King, centered itself around the main character and the main idea that relates around them, and then why people actually accepted them back then as who they are compared to that very era that preceded it. But then again, after that era came the newer problem that we discussed in Pixar's rise with films like Toy Story and then DreamWorks as well coming out in 3D animation. Because the 2000s brought in a new change when Disney went back to other stories without having music in them, the underrated classics we all love today, with others that are straight up classics with films like Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis, Lilo and Stitch, and Treasure Planet coming out. Where for the most part, except Lilo and Emperor's success on DVD, they were box office disappointments yet again. The films just never really connected with audiences at the time when other major studios were releasing these 3D films like Shrek that was more of a parody of Disney or whatnot, what they found emotional in stories like Toy Story, Monsters, Finding Nemo, and so forth. I mean, for Disney, at least they did have a relationship with Pixar at the time, but then again, company heads like Eisner during that same time would have actually destroyed it considering what the focus was for the company in terms of saving money and other big budget things. That until Iger later on actually bought Pixar straight out, where in some way, with the way they were releasing these movies in such busy times or in the same year as each other like Treasure Planet and so forth, they just cared less and less overall about it again. How they didn't care about 2D as much because there is a new form of animation that people are being told that has explosive box office success, where they would instead and try to find a way to preserve their status as being a bigwig, resulting in more complete messes like Home on the Range and Chicken Little to enter this new era themselves. Films that were once again varying in quality and only modest box office success, and were just not big enough to be successes for the time, going back and forth between 3D and 2D until Tangled actually changed things. I mean, yes, Winnie the Pooh is still their last 2D film, but they still just made so many where it becomes the point that Princess and the Frog is the real last 2D original animated film done by the studio. Because Tangled yet again restarted Disney like the Renaissance did, in the idea that The Little Mermaid did that wasn't quite a big hit, but still big enough to change the way that Disney moved in animation, having a great story with characters that develop alongside its journey, and of course having the classical songs that was headed by Alan Menken yet again. But of course, it wasn't just these musical movies that actually kickstarted it, but also great new stories like Wreck-It Ralph that took us in the world of gaming or whatever they could actually find that fleshed itself out that provided a good time most of us actually loved. And then having Frozen go back again, focusing on the fairy tale with two main sisters becoming one of the biggest animated hits of all time with over $1 billion, where other films like Zootopia would also follow suit with such popularity. That nowadays, with this new type of storytelling, Disney just reached their greatest high point they could ever do when films left and right could make that amount of money, added with newer properties each year like Marvel, Star Wars, and their newer live action remakes, a time where they found a formula that they could stick to and succeed regardless because they have that power of storytelling and people who are passionate enough to tell it. But the more they actually did that, the more they actually hurt themselves instead. Because for the most part, these stories weren't very bad and are still memorable to such high degrees, but started to blend itself into being more generic or safe as you could ever or B. They weren't differing from each other that you would usually expect like the Renaissance did in other previous Disney movies, where there can only be a certain amount of time before the well starts to dry and doing the same thing over and over again. Compared to the era we just mentioned before, where Disney wasn't even remotely a big company at all like they are now with these various properties, they just never wanted to experiment at all and stay within the same storytelling confines they actually love to do, such as twist villains and quirky characters and sequels that just do completely nothing with the story at all of which were finally combined with the launch of Disney Plus at the tail end of 2019 during the greatest box office year yet, where you would see billion-dollar hit after billion-dollar hit launching the legacy of what would have been Bob Iger's last years at the company for the better. But then again soon turned on its head with what happened after that was still under his and Chapek's watch with the properties they owned and COVID actually destroying the world into what it is today. An era where streaming services themselves become oversaturated and our expectations for movies certainly change, with the films they wanted back in public in this year of 2023 included films like Little Mermaid barely breaking even, only getting $500 million compared to previous live action films, Pixar with Elemental only being saved by word of mouth, Indiana Jones bombing, and Marvel's Ant-Man and the Marvels also ending up in the same position in total failure. Where finally with that legacy, Wish is actually joining that big failure with how slow their box office has been in that very regard. I mean, granted, compared to the numerous channels that only cover the opening weekends, it still has a lot more time to actually go into theaters and release in countries at later dates, just like Elemental did that would actually make the number go higher, but the numbers itself with a film like this that Disney usually would want for such great success are not doing enough to justify their budgets anymore. A time where prices have been steadily increasing more and more and people just aren't able to afford as much. Because when you look back at films like Encanto, that also wasn't a success in theaters, needing $300 million to break even and only achieving about $250 million. Something that is partially attributed to COVID itself at the time when families and films weren't exactly ready to come back, but also again because of Disney Plus itself choosing to release films early before its theatrical release or just for the sake of it to protect the general public. Because again, talking about why Pixar was failing at the same time too, was the fact that they were releasing their films only on Disney Plus, right in there in the comfort of our own homes, as COVID was still heavily impacting the world at the same time when films like Soul and Luca were released. And Encanto was still straddled in that same very time where it found greater success on Disney Plus and exploded across the internet into the hit everyone loves today, still having the great story beats that represents what good Disney storytelling really is, but also represented another problem that Disney themselves created in a platform that oversaturated the movies that they usually release. The films we said succeeded before Disney Plus happened were starting to get dumped on here as well, from their live action films and their TV shows of Marvel and Star Wars properties to their own animated movies, where more and more people just felt comfortable watching it at home instead of what they actually used to do, adding more cost than what you would usually expect to that same experience you can get anywhere else. That they themselves creating this and releasing films right here and there created this expectation to change differently about how films were actually consumed. That most of the generic safe films or just films they have did not actually require us to see them at all anymore like the event they used to be in theaters. Which is also a sad thing as well, because theaters are still a great place to actually watch friends with, but Disney and other companies just made it hard to do so when they never really wanted to change for the most part except for a couple few stories. Where as a result, most people actually changed their habits from before and stopped giving them the benefit of their view and money as long as they were going to do the same stupid crap that we were all tired of, meddling in the creative process to become as uncreative as possible, which is what films like Wish actually represented, because Wish is a good representation of where Disney is now and what they are as a company than what they used to be, with a messy unfinished story that could have actually worked but wanted to play it safe within the confines of what a Disney film is perceived to be to sell for their 100th anniversary. How the villain of this entire film is just Disney themselves getting our wishes and only really granting some of it while taking what they built at all for granted, confusing one half to the next because it had to meet one expectation that their modern stories tell and what their past older stories told. I mean, we don't know much about the production issues that went into it other than what we read here and there when it comes to the film being 2D at first and also the queen being evil and then on, but the story of Wish itself does give us clues that the story was there but just was missing overall because they wanted to add other Disney films to celebrate their 100 years with what we already know and love because of the fact they have stories that were already completed, just bringing us full circle to the problems older films like The Black Cauldron had creating something new for Disney but also ending ending up doing nothing with no sense of purpose or direction, which makes this even more disappointing when the movie tries to tie itself back into the core ideals of what Disney is and what already worked, using music and using story together while also forgetting the reason why they both worked together as a film in the first place. A problem that also affected other earlier films released after Encanto in 2022, being films like Strange World becoming one of their biggest box office bombs ever, something Wish can at least actually surpass and say they made more money at this moment, but also showed that people were just not interested in the direction they were taking with films like that, because overall, it did something Encanto already did better with the family dynamic and the adventure era that other previous films like Atlantis and Treasure Planet already did better from before and already sort of failed at the time financially, where what resulted from that story was just completely boring in its overall output. It's not a very bad film, but it just never had any major stakes or issues that would have made it compelling, especially in the use of A Strange World, when they focused on something that was already designed better from before in the previous story and decided to forget using a villain as a main source of conflict that would have actually made it an interesting story to tell. Something they just forgoed because they tried to change the reception of how poor the earlier stories were received in the twist villain era, and how again Magnifico and Wish tried to bridge it back but still refused to change elements that modern Disney already did that we already knew. And just like the Dark Age, there is a group within Disney that does not want to change their ways than what they already see as the easiest way moving forward. They don't want or feel like they don't need to experiment with something new that could tell another interesting story that they were always known for doing, like going back into 2D animation as they let that department go, or whatever it takes to actually bring those complete stories back. Most of these failures that they're experiencing are resulting from films that just don't hit the mark at all or just don't make any sense story-wise completely, easily forgettable just like that Dark Age. That they themselves are creating this environment that refuses to budge even more than they already should be known for, instead thinking sequels are the best way to save themselves. Where unfortunately in that regard, and the reality of the situation for big family franchises, is the fact that most sequels actually do work, in terms of financially speaking rather than critically, that the only way to get people back out is to do the same thing they already did with familiar characters, whether it be both Pixar or Disney, where most of their sequels have increased in box office revenue, which is very nice for their perspective and everyone else who knows these and love the stories overall, but they still haven't been able to tell good stories in that regard for the most part. They have elements that do work and that does connect to the most with the audience, but over time with what you actually learn, they just really don't work to complete stories. And because of that, it kind of stagnates Disney in a situation to perceive that this is the best way to create content, when other things like their original films are failing to capture the audience even with the Disney Plus problem that also comes into play. I mean, things can change like they always had, where Little Mermaid didn't actually reach the remake mark from before, but they still can't succeed as we've seen from before and by the more successful films that we know of, where even with opinions like Frozen have become more mixed, they still are a very popular piece of media throughout, where something about it just pulls people in and they still watch regardless whether the story is a complete mess. And another thing to point out about this is that the fact that they do have some good ideas for sequels like what Pixar can do with Inside Out, which I am very hopeful for and know that it can succeed with their storytelling record, while other films like Zootopia 2 for Disney directly can still be promising in that very era. But then looking back upon it and what they're also doing with adding pressures of others like Frozen and Toy Story, still feels like they're doing the same thing like Wish in the overall feeling of modern Disney animation, playing it safe with what we know and refusing to do something new or experimental, never changing from the point of where they began and what made those stories work in the first place. This is not the Disney that made the Black Cauldron clearly, where they have enough money to survive still, but they somehow still fall into that same similar mistakes that that film had at that time with the company, with too many people directing what could be done in the story that could either be this or that, and not attempting to explore what could have been, either using 3D or 2D both back and forth in all of the ways that could be told. Looking back on each film before the complete 3D era, which had various different character designs and aesthetics that built the world to be unique and have something compelling alongside it, where they should be able to market it if they actually believe in it. I mean, yes, this year is also unique as well, as I haven't included the strikes in that conversation that also prevented actors and other people from being part of the promotion of such films that we're used to that contribute to the less attention they get, but that still isn't a great excuse other than the fact that companies like Disney refuse to probably pay the people who work on their films. That in every single way, they just look for the easiest way to make a profit off of their films rather than putting in the effort on their part to support the stories alongside their releases. Most people just don't know nowadays about the films anymore or because of what Disney Plus does to release them eventually, where they just don't want to market it as well enough, where films like Elemental never succeeded as it could have had, where if it was shown differently, then maybe it could have succeeded on its own, where they just still badly hurt themselves by pushing something here rather than there because they're not passionate like the people who create it. These box office failures that they're experiencing left and right are more indicative of who runs Disney rather than who works at Disney. That they have talented people who really do care, and I'm sure they appreciate some of the work the executives have allowed, but those who are actually in charge just don't actually care for such ideas anymore in the world, trying to actually play it safe that are there in conversation culturally or what is ever relevant in their ignorant minds. That what they like to do now as a company is turn movies like Wish into products that celebrates them and what they could sell as merchandise rather than what all of us could enjoy as actual stories, the beauty that humanity can provide in storytelling that inspires us all. I'm sorry if I'm going off into tangents like that or whatever I find to justify this weird period of Disney, but I just care too much to actually ignore. I believe in these stories and the ideas that the man who made this company inspired us in the present, and I just really hope one day I could be part of that legacy too to continue these storytelling possibilities. But sadly just have to deal with a bunch of people who forget or don't even care about what they have anymore in the creative passion of these very stories. That they still have something to tell even in films like this that had potential but just chose to go the most generic boring route possible at a time where they have money to experiment even further. Like looking at a film like Encanto 2 years earlier and a film like Wish released right now, it's a very night and day difference and a company of two different ideas, one that actually cares about stories that they could actually tell and the other one confused to what they actually want and to sell a product to us as consumers. That we just don't understand why they seek to actually put this out when we know that even in this day and age and with the resources they have, they could create the best pieces of art imaginable, but just think and know that they don't want to do it at all. But hopefully, with what we saw in the past that almost sank the company, they will be able to bounce back forth, which I know they can. Not that next year or the next few years after that will be great, as the film releases are not going to be good or going to be any better than what this year actually provided, but just know in my heart with those two phases of Disney's own failures that they went through, that they will actually come back stronger than ever before. That people like me or any Disney fan who has passion about the ideas that the company can strive for can and will change things for the better in any voice we have, and the day that I hopefully lead Disney myself into the future at the top. And for those of you who actually care, I apologize if my videos have become very repetitive in nature, telling about these problems of Disney constantly instead of doing other things that actually interested me in a positive way, where I just again care too much passionately about everything that was Disney and seek to improve that in the very future, as that's the company's next CEO, if that is very possible. I will seek to move back into other animated movies and just movies in general that interest me, but knowing what we know from the beginning of this year, it's just been very clear that I really love Disney and will continue to love it for all time as the staple of this channel and the world of storytelling. And with that all said, I'm all done, so goodbye.